In this video, I'm going to make you an expert at Webflow Grids. I'm going to show you the various styles, how to make the grids mobile responsive, how to build common layouts, and then we're going to look at some real-world examples of more unique grid layouts being used online. And I'm going to show you how to build those as well. I'm Michael, the founder of Fitter Media, an agency that offers unlimited Webflow development to help companies complete projects faster and on budget. And on this channel, we offer Webflow development tips and tutorials so that you can become an expert at Webflow. But without any further ado, let's get into this video. If you like it, be sure to subscribe so you see more of this type of content. And also, we offer a ton of valuable resources in every video description, so be sure to check that out. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna go over is the basic functionality of a grid in Webflow. I'm gonna first show you how to create a grid, and then I'm going to show you how to manipulate the grid using the style panel in the designer. So there are a few ways we can create a grid in Webflow. First thing is we can go to the element panel, and then you will see right here, if we scroll down, under the other tab, we have grid. You can simply drop that into your canvas, and it will automatically create you a grid with 2 rows and 2 columns. That is one of the easier ways. However, I'm going to delete this really quick. And you can also add a grid by just adding in a simple div block. And then from there, in the style panel, we have this layout grid. If we click that, it does the exact same thing, and it turns this div block into a 2-column, 2-row grid. We tend to prefer this way, or at least I tend to prefer this way. I don't know, I just never got used to dragging in the grid element. I just use div blocks all the time. You can use div blocks for styles, and use div blocks a ton when building out a landing page. So I'm just used to adding in a quick div and turning it into a grid. What we tend to do at Fitter Media is we will design a base grid with a class attached to it so that whenever we want to build a grid, we just drop in the div, add the class, and then that adds all of our base styles. So I'll show you what I mean about that. So we will drop in this div. We usually just name it grid, or you can call it grid component or whatever you want to call it. From here, we will turn it into a grid. And then since at our agency, Fitter Media, we use rems instead of pixels, what I'll do is this gap right here, I will turn to rems. So 1 rem is equal to 16 pixels. So I'll do 1 rem. And the gap, in case you're wondering, all that does is it adds spacing between the grid cells. So if I were to increase this gap to, let's say, 4, you can see the gap between these cells have increased. So usually we will do 2 rem for our style system. That's just like what we like to do. And then from here, if I were to drop in another div, I can just easily go to the style selector and then type in grid. Click on that, and it will immediately turn it into a grid. Say this specific grid was for homepage like features, like for an app landing page, and the base grid styles don't apply. Then what we would do is we would just add a combo class. So is home features, and again, you can make your combo class whatever you want. And then here is where we will start adding additional columns or rows or whatever we need to for that specific grid. But the reason we do it this way is because we can build a base grid once that matches our site's styles, like spacing and things like that, and then also making it mobile responsive. And then all we have to do is add a combo class to customize the grid for a specific layout. So I'm going to get rid of this first grid right here. Now this grid right here, under the layout settings, this will apply no matter if you added a div and turned it into a grid or if you brought in the actual div grid element. These same styles will be the exact same. So here we have columns. If I increase it by 1, you can see we now have 3 columns, and here are rows. If I increase the rows, we now have 3 rows. It's just hard to see because it kind of collapsed the cells since there's no content inside of it. Now, one thing with rows that is different from columns is you can go all the way down to 1 row, and if you add more content than there is columns. So right here we have 3 columns. So I'm just going to add some content to this grid. I'm just going to add another div block. I'm just going to call this grid item. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of styling here so that we can see what is going on. I'm going to add a bit of background color so we can distinguish it from the background. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of border radius. All right, so here, if I just duplicate this, we have 3 columns. The thing that I was trying to say about the rows being different from the columns is even though we specified 1 row, if I were to duplicate a 4th grid item, Webflow will automatically create another row. So here we have 2 rows. We technically don't have to specify that there are 2 rows because Webflow will automatically add an additional row if there is enough of items in the grid. The way that is different from the columns is because Webflow won't automatically create columns. You have to manually select how many columns you want. So I'm going to add a 4th column, and you can see here now it collapses it down to 4 columns. Okay, so I'm going to add some more content in these grid items so we can distinguish each item from the other ones. So I'm just going to do cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, cell 4. And then I'm going to turn this into a 2-column grid. Now from here under direction, this is where you can change the direction of the grid. So you can see by default, cell 1 is in the first cell, cell 2 is right beside it horizontally, it's in cell 2, and then we have cell 3, cell 4. It kind of follows this horizontal layout. If you wanted cell 2 to be down here under cell 1, all we have to do is click this vertical direction setting, and then that will change the direction of the grid. There we go. So when I select the direction vertical, you can see cell 1 is now where it was before, but cell 2 is now directly underneath it. And then cell 3, cell 4. So it kind of creates a vertical stack instead of a horizontal stack. And then from here, obviously we went over the gap. That just changes the spacing in between grids. And in case you're not that used to Webflow, you'll see that some of these settings applied are orange and some are blue. The orange setting, the settings that are colored in orange, means the settings are being applied on the parent class, so grid. So if I were to remove this combo class, you can see now these items turn blue instead of orange. If I were to add the combo class back, you can see they're orange because they are settings being applied to the grid element, not necessarily to the combo class. Now the ones that are blue, those are the classes that we overwritten on the parent element, and we added those features, those settings specifically to the combo class. Okay, so now that is most of the settings. We do have some alignment settings here. So for example, if I were to align things to the left, you can see it will collapse the elements inside as small as they'll go. The only way you can override this is if you have a width set. So if we increase our width, like this is too much, like 4 rems, you can see as we increase this, it will collapse the cell items as much as possible until it hits the element's width. So that is what this alignment is. You can kind of play around with this alignment, see how it works. We can align to the center, align to the left, and so on and so forth. Now, one quick thing regarding the cell items, so the elements within the cell. Here under grid item, you can see I will have an entirely new set of settings versus if this grid item element was placed outside of the grid. So if I paste it outside of the grid and click on it, you can see we don't have all those settings here. These are settings specifically for the grid child, so the element that is within the grid. We have alignment, justification, order. All these settings right here are settings that will apply to this element specifically, and it won't apply to the other elements. So with most elements in Webflow, if you add a class and you change a setting, so like a padding or something, it will apply to all elements with that class. However, with these grid child settings, if I were to align this one to the center, you can see it only applies to this one. At first, this may seem a little confusing, but it actually gets really helpful because sometimes different grid items or grid childs needs to have custom settings applied to it that don't apply to the rest of the cells. And then this order right here, this basically, you can customize the order of these grid items without having to turn it into a manual grid, which I'll show you here in a bit. But we can immediately make cell 1 the last cell by making it last. And then you can also add in custom positioning here to position it throughout the grid. And then once you want to just cancel out those settings, you just simply hit X and then it will revert back to normal. Now, one really cool thing with Webflow Grids is you can span multiple columns with one grid child. So for example, I'm going to add a few more rows here. I'm going to turn this grid into a 3 grid. Add a few more items. Now what we can do is if I click on this grid item, you'll see it highlights the element and then there's a little dot in the corner. If I were to grab that, I can drag it over into another cell, and if I let go, it will now take up 2 columns instead of just 1. And I can do this for as many cells as I want. So I can bring it down here, have it cover 4. This is how you can create really unique grid layouts that look really cool. And I'm going to these are actually some of the layouts that we are going to look at that in the real world online that big companies are using, and we're going to show you how to build those. But this is really cool. This is how you can create a unique layout really quickly. And this is also mobile responsive. So if I were to go down to mobile, and then let me decrease some of our padding here. And then let's say I wanted this back to normal. I wanted it just to take up 1 cell. I can select it, highlight just the 1 cell, and now the grid is back to normal. But if I go to desktop, the grid remains the same. So this is really good for mobile responsiveness. Grids can get kind of tricky with on mobile, so you just want to make sure that whatever grid you create on desktop, that it's optimized for mobile. Most grids, unless you shrink them down, will have to have a vertical stack on mobile, or else they'll start going past the page and creating responsiveness issues. Okay, so the next thing we are going to go over regarding the grid is currently we are on, if I click on these grid settings right here, right here. Oh yeah. So if I click on a grid item, you can see currently we are on position auto, but I can click on position manual, and this is where we can manually plot this grid item anywhere in any cell in this grid that we want to. So say I want it down here under this grid, or say I want this cell down here in this cell. I want this cell up in this cell. So I just want to swap cell 1 with the last cell in the grid. All we have to do is take this grid, turn it to manual as well, and you can see our coordinates. This one is found at 3, 3, 3, 3. And this one is found at 1, 1, 1, 1. So all we have to do is replace this. So I'm going to turn this into 3, 3, 3, 3. Now we're down here. Now I want to go in our navigator, find the last grid item, and then I want to turn this into 1, 1, 1, 1. And you can see I have manually placed these items at different spots in the grid. And you can do that for any grid item. So here, the center one, if I turn this into a manual positioning, this is 2, 2, 2, 2. say I want to swap these two, I'll turn that to manual as well. This is 2211, and this is 2222. So all I have to do is change these to 1, and then I will go to that second one and change these to 2. And now we have successfully plotted these cells on in different places on the grid. So this is really powerful. You can completely manipulate this grid however you want. Just keep in mind when making these types of grids mobile responsive, things can get a little bit more messy. But other than that, this encapsulates most of the settings for the grid. Using just this alone, you can build some really unique style grids. And yeah. So I'm going to turn this back to position auto. I'm going to turn all of them back to position auto really quickly. And the ones that have manual positioning applied in the navigator, you can see they have this little grid icon. That means they are set to manual positioning. So it's really easy to find which items are manual and which ones are auto. Okay, so one thing we're going to cover really quickly before we move on to some real world examples is mobile responsiveness. So we covered that a little bit, but I'm going to show you how to make your grids even more mobile responsive. So if we go to mobile, say we want this to be a 2-column grid instead of a 3-column grid. All we have to do is in the style panel, change this from 3 columns down to 2 columns. And if we go back to desktop, it's still a 3-column grid. So that is how you can make your grids mobile responsive. So mobile is a 2-column grid. Say we want to go to mobile portrait and we want to turn this into a 1-column grid. Now this grid is completely mobile responsive. And it's unique to the screen size that people are viewing it on. So that covers most of the settings for the grid. Now let's look at some real world examples. So the first example that we have, we actually built right now, and that is a standard blog grid, or like a basic grid layout that includes like content. So here is our blog, the Fitter Media blog, and all it is a 3-column grid. If I were to inspect this page, you can see this grid is also mobile responsive. So as I shrink down the size of the grid, it changes based on the breakpoint that the person is viewing it on. So this is the power of grids. It makes mobile responsive design very, very easy. There are very little changes you have to apply in order to make a grid completely mobile responsive. But this is how you build the first real world example. Now we're going to go into a few more complicated examples. So the first one can be found on Instantly. And if we scroll down, you'll see Instantly has these little feature sections where there's an image to the left and text to the right. You can build this with Flexbox in Webflow, but a really easy way to do this can actually be to use a grid. So all we have to do is go back to our project. I'm going to delete these. I'm going to take this grid and I'm going to turn it into a 2-column grid. We just need 1 row, and then I'm going to delete that. So we're just going to pretend this is an image. And then when adding text to a grid, you have to add them within a div block, or else you can only add 1 text element to the grid item. So for example, in Instantly, they have a heading, a button, and then another button. If we were to try to add a heading and then a button, you can see it adds it to another cell. So in order to fix this, all we have to do is add a div to this cell, and then within this div, we can add our heading, and then we can add our button. And then from here, we can either align this to the center in 2 ways. We can go down to our align and align it to the center, or we can just go to the base grid element, and then we can go and align this to the center, like so. Now, if we want this text on this side, all we have to do is grab our div block, drag it above the other element, And now we have it on the left-hand side. And then just like normal, if for a tablet, if we wanted to make this a one column grid, all we have to do is select our grid element, and then we will change the columns from 2 to 1. And now we immediately have a vertical grid. So like I said, building layouts like that with grids is actually really helpful because it is very easy to customize for mobile. Now, one thing that I want to go over, say we have 2 grids like this, stacked on top of each other, and then their layout is inverted. So we have text on the left, image on the right, and then we have image on the left, text on the right. On desktop, this looks great, but if we go to tablet, you can see it looks off because we have text on top, image on bottom, and then we have image on top, text on bottom. And when you're scrolling through on mobile, that just won't look that great. It would look better if we had text on top, image on bottom for both of these. So there are a few ways we can tackle this. First way is we can change this grid where we can make it a vertical grid. So first way we can do this is we can take this bottom grid, we'll open it up, we'll take the first grid item, which is the image, and then we will make this as the last. And then if we do that, it inverts it that easily, and now we changed our grid layout. What is cool is for some layouts, you'll find that on desktop, a grid makes sense, but then sometimes you want to switch to Flexbox on mobile for various reasons. And we can do that real easily by just selecting our grid. And then on mobile, we can turn it into Flex, and then we now have Flexbox at our full control. So you can turn a grid into a Flexbox at any point in time that you want, but for now, we are just going to keep this as a grid. So that is how we build this type of a section with grid. Next grid layout we are going to look at is found on ClickUp. If we go down to the bottom of their page, we see this really cool grid right here. So you can see they have a 3-column grid up top, and then this item spans 2 columns, and then this item spans 2 columns. So this is actually really easy to do. All we have to do is, let's go back to our Webflow project. I'm going to delete these grids. I'm going to add our div block, add our grid class. That immediately turns it into a grid using all of our styles that we pre-applied, making sure the gap is set to rems instead of pixels. And then I'm going to do is ClickUp grid. So let's look back at ClickUp. So the base grid is 3 columns wide. So we're going to turn this grid into 3 columns, and then we are going to add in our elements. So we're going to do div. I'm just going to use our old grid item look, except for this one, I'm going to take off the ratio. Okay. So let's look, if you want to first look at how many items they have in the grid. So they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we're going to add 7. Now you can see right off the bat, this doesn't look like this grid, even though this grid, our grid has the exact same amount of items within the grid. But we're going to do exactly what we learned in the earlier part of the video. If we go to the ClickUp grid, this item, which is the 4th item in the grid, it spans 2 columns. So we're going to go to our 4th item in the grid. We're going to span this 2 columns. And then the last item in the grid spans 2 columns as well. So we're going to grab that item, span it 2 columns, and now we have an identical grid to ClickUp's grid. The only difference is styling, and these grid items are a little bit bigger, but the actual shape of the grid is the exact same as our grid. Now, one thing you will see is using the grid layout for grids like this where everything matches perfectly and aligns perfectly, that is great. But if you want more of a Pinterest style grid where elements are like the height of elements may be different, and then the next item collapses underneath. So let's just go to Pinterest real quick. Okay, so I searched for motorcycles. I'm really into motorcycles. I have an R1 and an R6. But if we scroll down through this grid, you can see the grid isn't aligned. So for example, this second item is shorter than the first, which means the item under that collapses up to it. And this grid is, everything is like responsive. Like if the height isn't the same, the next option will stack up underneath it. This actually is more, this type of layout is better to build when using Flexbox. At least that's how I prefer it to do it. So let's do that really quickly. I'm going to include this in the grid video because technically we're using Flexbox. However, it still creates a grid layout, and it's really useful to know how to build these types of layouts because you may want to do this on your company's website, or if you are a freelancer or an agency, you're going to at some point have a client request one of these. So it's really good to know how to do. All right, so to build a Pinterest style grid, we are going to drop in our div. We're just going to name this Pinterest grid. We're going to turn this into Flexbox. The position is going to be horizontal. And then within here, we want to add as many divs as we have columns. So if it's going to be a 3-column grid, we're going to add in 3 divs, and we're just going to do grid column. We're going to make 3 of these, and then we are going to make the width of these 33%. That is about 1/3 of the width. And then under our Pinterest grid, we are going to add a gap. So we're going to do a 2rem gap, a 2rem gap. My God. All right. So now under the columns, we are going to add our grid items. So in the first column, we're going to add our div block. We're going to do grid item like before, and that will span the full width. And then what we want to do is in our second grid column, we're going to add grid item, or we're first going to add a div, and then grid item. And I already have a combo class for this for large, which it's a little bit taller. And then over here, we're going to paste in our other grid item. Okay, so now we have our base grid layout set. What we're going to do is we're then going to add in some more grid items. So I'm going to add in a large grid item on the first grid. I'm going to add in a small grid item on the second column. And then I'm going to add a small item on the third column. And then what we want to do is we want to have the same amount of gap for our base grid that is applied. So we have a 2rem gap. For our columns, we also want to do flex vertical, and then we want to set a 2rem gap so things look normal. And then you can see here, we now have successfully created a Pinterest style grid, but it's using Flexbox instead. And as you can see, it is still completely mobile responsive. We just have a bit more work to do when making this mobile responsive on like a tablet or a mobile device. So if we go to tablet, that looks pretty good. If we go to mobile, still looks pretty good. We can decrease the gap a little bit. So if you want to decrease the gap of this grid, you have to do it in 2 places. First, you have to do it on the grid element. So we're going to do it to 1. And then you have to do it on the columns. So we're going to do those 1 as well. And then if we go to mobile portrait, you can see now it is completely messed up. And that is normal. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn this into a 1-column grid. So we are going to select our grid column. And then it is set to 33%. We're going to set it to 100. And you can see that still hasn't fixed much. That is because our grid element is still set to flex direction horizontal. We're going to change this to vertical. And then once we did that, you can see now we have a beautiful single column grid. And this grid is completely mobile responsive. So that is how you build common grid layouts in Webflow. If you have any questions about how to build a grid in Webflow, put those in the comments below and we'll try our best to get back to you. Also, if you're a company who's looking to complete your Webflow projects faster and on budget, we offer unlimited Webflow development at a flat monthly rate. There'll be a link in the description where you can schedule a strategy call with us. Also, there are tons of resources on our website and in the description below, so be sure to check those out.